Darkness was their only sanctuary until it wasn't. Tokyo slept, its citizens drawing comfort from night's reliable embrace, the one ally that kept American bombers blind and distant. They never imagined night itself could be stolen. The blackout bombs came first, turning darkness to cruel daylight, exposing the sprawling city like a sacrifice on an altar. Japan thought night raids were impossible, became the epitaph for thousands. The city burned with a light that shouldn't exist, while above, metal birds circled with mechanical patience. The generals sat in their underground command center, cigarette smoke coiling around maps of Tokyo spread across wooden tables. Outside, darkness had fallen hours ago, a reliable ally that had protected Japan's cities since the war began. Major Tanaka traced his finger across the harbor districts, explaining once more to his civilian counterparts why Americans couldn't mount effective night raids against the capital. The limitations were insurmountable. Navigation errors, the difficulty of target identification, the dispersal of their bombs across meaningless territory. They had seen it in reports from Germany. Night bombing was a gesture of desperation, not a strategy of victory. Cherry blossoms had fallen early that year, a fact that disturbed the more superstitious officers, though none would admit it aloud. The spring air carried a peculiar stillness that seemed to settle over Tokyo like a held breath. In the residential districts, families slept with windows open to catch the occasional breeze, some on rooftops to escape the stuffiness of homes built too close together. Radio broadcasts had ended hours ago, replaced by the familiar symphony of the metropolis at night, distant factories working through darkness, the occasional military vehicle, the soft murmur of air moving through millions of sleeping lungs. Above the city, clouds parted occasionally to reveal stars, the same stars American navigators would find insufficient for precision bombing. Imperial meteorologists had provided comprehensive analyses of Tokyo's cloud patterns, fog tendencies, and visibility metrics, all confirming what military leaders already believed. The capital enjoyed natural protection against night attacks. Radar stations dotted the coastline, their operators fighting drowsiness, watching scopes that had shown nothing but merchant shipping for weeks. The night shift was considered punitive duty. Nothing happened after dark. Everyone knew that. In the harbor, the water reflected scattered lights from essential facilities operating under careful blackout protocols. Anti-aircraft batteries stood in silent vigilance, their crews playing cards or dozing beside guns pointed at empty skies. Training manuals emphasized daytime interception tactics. Night fighting remained a theoretical concept with minimal practical application. Japanese fighter pilots slept in their barracks, their aircraft secured in reinforced hangars. No one had seriously contemplated the logistics of scrambling squadrons in complete darkness. The risk of accidents seemed greater than the threat of enemy action. On the outskirts of the city, in a small farming community, an old man named Hiroshi couldn't sleep. He stood outside his modest home, eyes fixed on the western horizon where something troubled him, not a sound or sight, but an absence that his weathered senses couldn't properly identify. 68 years of living close to the land had taught him to read subtle warnings. Animals were too quiet tonight. The night birds had fallen silent hours ago and hadn't resumed their calls. In the nearby pen, his usually placid ox stood alert, nostrils flaring toward the same western sky that disturbed the old farmer. Something was coming. The certainty settled in Hiroshi's bones, like cold water seeping into rice paddies. He considered waking his son's family but hesitated, embarrassed by the thought of raising an alarm over nothing but an old man's nerves. Instead, he lit a small pipe and continued his vigil, watching the dark horizon where sea met sky, where America waited beyond the curve of the earth. The tobacco tasted bitter tonight, the smoke hanging unnaturally in the still air, as if reluctant to rise and join the darkness that had protected Tokyo since the first bombs fell. Colonel James Harrison hunched over the classified blueprints, the blue glow of a desk lamp casting harsh shadows across his weathered face. Scattered around him were photographs of Tokyo, aerial reconnaissance, smuggled street images, tourist postcards from before the war, any scrap that might reveal the city's secrets. For 18 months, he had lived and breathed this problem, how to strike Japan's heart in darkness. The solution had come not from weapon designers, but from a photographer's casual remark about magnesium flashes. Harrison had immediately seen the potential, not flares, which were too brief and limited, but something new entirely. The Blackout bombs didn't look particularly special, cylindrical casings with stabilizing fins, weighing approximately 200 pounds each. Their revolutionary nature lay inside, a precisely calculated mixture of magnesium, aluminum powder, and oxidizing agents that would burn with extraordinary intensity for nearly 15 minutes once triggered. They weren't weapons of destruction, but weapons of revelation. When strategically dispersed across specific coordinates, they would create a temporary artificial daylight over target zones. The light would be so intense that shadows would be virtually eliminated, rendering the city below as visible as under a noon sun. Outside Harrison's office window, B-29 superfortresses lined the airfield on Tinian Island. Their sleek silver bodies gleamed under floodlights as ground crews swarmed around them, loading the special ordnance into bomb bays. Each aircraft had been modified with specialized navigation equipment and heat shields to protect crews from the blinding glare they would create. Pilots and bombardiers had trained for months using simulations, practicing the precise timing and positioning that would transform night into day over the unsuspecting Japanese capital. The men called it Operation Midnight Sun, though no such name appeared in official documents. The meteorologists had promised perfect conditions, high cloud cover to reflect and amplify the light, minimal ground fog, and a gentle crosswind to clear smoke without dispersing the illumination too quickly. Harrison reviewed the flight paths once more, tracing lines that would bring the first wave of aircraft, the Illuminators, over Tokyo's outskirts at precisely 2:17 a.m. local time. The primary bombers would follow 12 minutes later, when the artificial daylight reached full intensity. The timing had to be flawless. The illumination would last only long enough for one concentrated attack before darkness reclaimed the city. In the briefing room next door, navigators and bombardiers studied their target folders with unusual intensity. Unlike previous missions, their success wouldn't be measured in structures destroyed, but in square miles illuminated. The psychological impact would be as important as physical damage to transform Night, Japan's faithful protector, into an ally of American bombers. Several crews had questioned the concept during training, skeptical that sufficient illumination could be achieved. Those doubts had vanished during the test over uninhabited Pacific Islands when the light had been visible from nearly 70 miles away. Colonel Harrison closed the folder and rubbed his tired eyes. In less than 14 hours, the theoretical would become devastatingly real. He thought of the civilians in Tokyo, sleeping under the false protection of darkness, unaware that American ingenuity had found a way to steal night itself. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to acknowledge the horror of what they were about to unleash. Not just bombs, but the destruction of certainty. The revelation that nothing, not even darkness, could be trusted anymore. Then he pushed the thought away, replacing it with the memory of Pearl Harbor's burning ships, and sealed the operation orders with steady hands. The first indication came not as sound, but as a change in the texture of darkness. Citizens who happened to be awake, night shift workers, insomniacs, nursing mothers, noticed it first. A subtle brightening along the western edges of Tokyo, as if dawn had decided to arrive from the wrong direction, hours too early. The illumination didn't burst forth dramatically, but crept steadily across neighborhoods, climbing walls and slipping through bamboo blinds with patient inevitability. Unlike natural light, it cast no softness, no gentle transition, only harsh, revealing brilliance that transformed familiar spaces into something alien and exposed. Air raid sirens remained eerily silent for the crucial first minutes. Radar operators stared in confusion at screens showing aircraft formations, too perfectly aligned to be anything but American. Yet no bombs were falling. Instead, strange cylindrical objects descended on parachutes, igniting mid-air into blinding incandescence that seemed to violate physical laws. When the warning sirens finally wailed to life, their urgent cry came too late. The artificial day had already established itself over western Tokyo, spreading eastward in a methodical tide of unwelcome revelation. Light reflected off clouds, multiplied by water surfaces, ricocheted between buildings until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Takeshi Yamamoto, a civil defense coordinator, stood paralyzed on his apartment balcony, watching the impossible brightness consuming his city. Training had prepared him for fires, for explosions, for the aftermath of conventional raids, but nothing had prepared him for this theft of night itself. His neighbors emerged from their homes in confused terror, some covering their eyes against the glare, others pointing speechlessly at the sky where American bombers now appeared, perfectly visible in what should have been protective darkness. The aircraft moved with deliberate confidence, their silver bodies reflecting the very light they had created. In military command centers, chaos erupted as officers struggled to comprehend what was happening. Fighter pilots scrambled toward aircraft, blinded by the unnatural daylight that eliminated the shadows they relied upon for depth perception. Anti-aircraft gunners found themselves equally disadvantaged. The illumination created a ceiling of light, against which American bombers appeared as dark silhouettes, precisely opposite to their usual targeting conditions. Frantic orders contradicted each other as the chain of command fractured under the psychological impact of seeing their fundamental defense strategy neutralized in minutes. The bombs began falling 17 minutes after the first light appeared, conventional explosives and incendiaries now delivered with daylight precision. Factory districts that had been carefully camouflaged against aerial observation stood naked and distinct under the revealing glare. Residential areas, previously difficult to target specifically, became clearly defined grids of vulnerability. The city that had been designed to hide in darkness now found itself helplessly exposed, its every feature clarified for destruction. American bombardiers who had trained for this moment using specially filtered goggles found their targets with unprecedented accuracy. Tokyo burned with a double brightness, the cold chemical light from above merging with the organic orange flames spreading below. Those who survived would later speak of the strange shadows that night, how they seemed to move in wrong directions, how familiar objects cast unfamiliar shapes, how the combined light created a hellish illumination that seemed to reveal not just the physical city, but something deeper and more terrible about the nature of war itself. As Takeshi finally broke from his paralysis to help a family from a collapsed home, he realized the most horrifying aspect wasn't the bombs or even the fire. It was the absolute certainty that darkness, their last refuge, would never again provide the comfort of protection. Hospital corridors overflowed with the bewildered and the burned, their injuries bearing the unique signatures of this new form of warfare. Dr. Sakamoto worked mechanically, moving from patient to patient with diminishing medical supplies and expanding despair. Most distinctive were the eye injuries, retinas scarred by looking directly at the blackout bombs during their initial ignition. Children suffered worst, their curiosity having drawn their gaze upward at the critical moment when darkness transformed into blinding day. The doctor paused beside a 6-year-old girl whose eyes were bandaged, her small hands clutching a charred doll, lips moving in continual questions about when the light would stop hurting. Dawn came eventually, though few could distinguish its natural light from the artificial brightness that had preceded it. The Blackout bombs had mostly burned out by then, leaving behind suspended particles that turned the morning sky a sickly yellowish grey. Rescue workers moved through devastation that seemed more absolute than previous raids. The precision granted by illumination had allowed Americans to target infrastructure with surgical focus: water systems, power stations, transportation hubs, compounding the suffering in ways random bombing never could. Survivors gathered in parks and open spaces, their expressions uniformly haunted by the night's fundamental betrayal of natural order. Imperial officials gathered in an emergency session, their faces ashen under the constant yellow emergency lighting of the bunker. Military strategists, who had confidently dismissed the possibility of effective night raids, now sat in shamed silence as damage reports accumulated. The psychological impact appeared as significant as the physical destruction. Citizens were reporting to neighborhood associations that they no longer felt safe at any hour. Air defense commanders presented hasty plans for countering future illumination raids, though everyone present understood the hollow inadequacy of their proposals. How does one hide a city once the enemy has demonstrated the ability to eliminate darkness at will? Emperor Hirohito received the briefing in his private chambers, his expression unreadable as ministers detailed the previous night's events. When they finished, silence hung heavily until the emperor spoke, his voice softer than usual. "They have taken ownership of our night skies." The simple observation carried more weight than any emotional outburst could have. Outside the palace walls, smoke continued rising from dozens of districts, creating a pall that would normally have darkened the city, but instead diffused the sunlight into an omnipresent glare that offered no shadows in which to hide. Imperial photographers were strictly forbidden from documenting the devastation. In what remained of the Matsunaga neighborhood, old Hiroshi helped neighbors clear rubble from a communal water pump. His son had not survived the night, caught in the open when the light came, then by shrapnel from an anti-aircraft shell fired in desperate confusion. The old farmer worked methodically, his weathered hands bleeding from sharp debris, his mind focused entirely on the immediate task of survival. When asked by a younger man what he thought would happen next, Hiroshi paused, looking toward the horizon where evening would eventually arrive. "They will come again," he said simply, "and we will learn to fear both light and darkness." Military sensors worked frantically to control information about the new American capability, but witness accounts spread through whispered conversations and hastily scrawled notes. By midday, the term Hikari Bakudan, light bombs, had entered Tokyo's lexicon. Government radio broadcasts made no mention of the illumination aspects of the raid, describing only conventional bombing. But the truth couldn't be contained when thousands had witnessed the night turn to day. In outlying villages, farmers reported finding spent casings from the Blackout bombs, their interiors coated with unusual residues that sparkled even after the primary chemicals had burned away. As sunset approached, a different kind of darkness settled over Tokyo, not the physical absence of light, but a psychological shadow of anticipation and dread. Families huddled together in whatever shelter remained, eyes continuously darting toward western skies. The city that had once welcomed night as protection now feared its arrival as prelude to fresh revelation and destruction. Air defense units stood at highest alert, though their commanders understood the fundamental futility of their position. How does one fight an enemy who has mastered the manipulation of light itself? In his temporary headquarters, General Korechika Anami stared at reports of approaching American aircraft and wondered if this might be the night Tokyo ceased to exist altogether. 3 weeks after the first illumination raid, Tokyo existed in a state of perpetual twilight consciousness. The physical scars were everywhere: burned buildings, cratered streets, the distinctive patterns of destruction that spoke of precision targeting made possible only through artificial daylight. Yet the deeper wounds remained invisible, the collective trauma of a population that had lost faith in the natural order itself. Children refused to sleep at night, clinging to parents with panic that no reassurance could soothe. Adults moved through their days with the mechanical efficiency of those who must function despite the certainty of approaching horror. The Americans had not used the blackout bombs every night, a psychological refinement that military analysts recognized as cruelly effective. 3 or 4 evenings might pass without incident, allowing fragile hope to build, only to be shattered when the western sky once again brightened at an impossible hour. Naval intelligence had intercepted American communications, suggesting a deliberate strategy of unpredictability designed to maximize psychological impact. Every sunset brought renewed tension. Every sunrise without a raid offered not relief, but merely postponement of the inevitable. The uncertainty had proven as destructive to morale as the bombing itself. Adaptation emerged in desperate forms. Buildings that remained standing were being modified with reflective materials on rooftops, aluminum strips, broken mirrors, anything that might create confusing glare for bombardiers working under artificial illumination. Neighborhood civil defense units had developed new protocols, establishing underground shelters specifically designed to protect against the combined threats of light and conventional bombing. Most telling were the blankets soaked in water and mud that people now wore over their heads when moving at night, not for protection from shrapnel, but to shield eyes from the blinding moment when darkness might suddenly transform to burning day. Imperial scientists worked feverishly to understand and counter the American technology. Captured fragments of the blackout bombs underwent careful analysis in underground laboratories, their chemical compositions reverse-engineered through exhaustive testing. The findings offered little comfort. The Americans had combined existing materials in ways Japanese industry couldn't quickly replicate due to resource limitations. More concerning were intelligence reports suggesting the Americans were already developing improved versions with longer burn durations and even greater luminosity. The technological gap was widening precisely when Japan most needed to close it. In what had once been a small shrine at the edge of the Sumida River, now reduced to foundation stones and a single standing torii gate, a group of elderly citizens gathered at dusk. They came daily, regardless of weather or warnings, to perform a ritual of their own creation, part traditional prayer, part modern defiance. As the sun touched the horizon, they lit paper lanterns and placed them on small wooden boats, then set them adrift on the river. Each flame represented a small reclaiming of light itself, an assertion that illumination could still belong to the Japanese people rather than serving only as a weapon of their enemies. Authorities considered stopping the practice, but ultimately allowed it to continue. Some symbols of hope must be permitted, even in dying cities. As night settled fully over Tokyo, the last traces of natural sunset fading from clouds, Hiroshi stood in the small field where he had replanted vegetables among the ashes of his former neighborhood. Around him, survivors moved with the tense alertness of prey animals, their attention constantly drawn to the western sky where American bombers might appear at any moment. The old farmer continued working by touch rather than sight, his fingers finding the weeds among crop stems through decades of agricultural memory. When a young mother hurrying past asked why he bothered planting when everything might burn tomorrow, Hiroshi didn't look up from his task. "The Americans have stolen our darkness," he answered, pressing a seed into the soil with careful precision. "But they cannot take our tomorrow unless we surrender it first." Above him, stars emerged one by one in the fragile darkness, beautiful and terrible in their temporary presence.